The morning sun over Dallas shimmered against the glass windows of the bustling airport terminal. It was one of those days when travel felt strangely mechanical. Thousands of people moving in synchronized chaos, dragging suitcases, balancing coffee cups, glancing impatiently at departure boards. For most, it was routine. Another flight, another city, another stretch of sky between work and home. On Gate C-23, passengers queued for Flight 2281, bound for Denver. The line snaked around, a tangle of weary commuters, families with restless children, and a few solo travelers carrying nothing but backpacks. Over the intercom, the gate agent's voice crackled cheerfully, calling boarding groups like an auctioneer. Inside the aircraft, a Boeing 737 gleamed, with that slightly worn look of a plane that had seen thousands of journeys, but was still reliable. The flight attendants moved efficiently, greeting passengers with professional smiles, directing them to their seats. Overhead bins filled quickly with roller bags and coats shoved carelessly into corners. Row 14, Seat B, was occupied by a man few people noticed. Mid-50s, silver gray at the temples, a plain navy jacket, and a face that suggested both strength and restraint. He carried no flashy gadgets, no noise-canceling headphones, no air of entitlement. Instead, he slid quietly into his seat, opened a battered paperback novel, and began reading. To the passengers around him, he was just another anonymous traveler. In row 8, a mother soothed her fussy toddler, bouncing the child gently on her lap while her husband tried to stow a stroller in the overhead bin. In row 22, a group of college students laughed too loudly, excited about a ski trip to Colorado. Up front in first class, a businessman tapped away on his laptop as though the entire world depended on the document on his screen. Life, in its varied forms, was condensed into this metal tube about to climb into the sky. As boarding finished, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Reynolds, alongside First Officer Hayes. We'll be flying you up to Denver today. Weather looks clear most of the way, with a little turbulence over the Rockies. We're scheduled for a smooth ride and an on-time arrival. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The engines roared to life, a deep hum that vibrated through the cabin. The plane backed away from the gate, taxied slowly across the tarmac, and paused at the runway threshold. With a surge of power, the jet rocketed forward, lifting off into the morning sky. Inside, the usual rituals unfolded. Passengers leaned back as gravity pressed them into their seats. A few clutched armrests nervously. Others barely noticed, already engrossed in phones or books. Seatbelt signs chimed, and the cabin crew began their safety checks, moving gracefully down the aisles. From 14B, the quiet man glanced briefly out the window, watching the city shrink below them. He marked his page with a folded receipt, closed the book for a moment, and let his gaze linger on the horizon. Something in his eyes suggested experience, someone who had looked out at countless horizons before, perhaps under far different circumstances. But no one noticed. To everyone else, he was invisible. By 10,000 feet, trays of drinks clattered down the aisle. Coffee was poured, sodas fizzed, and the familiar aroma of airline snacks filled the air. Passengers settled into their routines. A teenager plugged into music. A grandmother flipped through a crossword puzzle. Conversations hummed quietly, merging into the white noise of the engines. The aircraft leveled off at 30,000 feet, cruising smoothly above scattered clouds. Sunlight spilled through the oval windows, casting warm patches on faces and tray tables. It was peaceful, almost serene, the kind of flight where people forget they're hurtling through the sky in a pressurized metal cylinder. Yet beneath the calm, subtle cracks were forming signs no one could see. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds shifted slightly in his seat. He had been a pilot for over 20 years, disciplined and dependable, but that morning something felt off. His hands trembled faintly on the yoke, and his vision blurred for a moment before clearing again. He brushed it off, attributing it to fatigue, dehydration, maybe just age catching up with him. The first officer, Hayes, a younger man in his 30s, focused on the instruments. He didn't notice the captain's discomfort. Pilots rarely admitted weakness in the cockpit. The culture was built on competence, on projecting control, on never letting doubt slip through. Back in the cabin, laughter rose from row 22 again. The college students were debating whether they'd rent snowboards or skis. A few rows ahead, the mother finally got her toddler to sleep, her head resting gratefully against the seatback. The businessman in first class sighed, closed his laptop, and ordered another coffee. The man in 14B returned to his novel, the hum of the engines blending into the rhythm of the words. He seemed at peace, detached from the bustle around him. But now and then, he glanced toward the front of the plane, as if listening for something only he could hear. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering refills, collecting trash. Everything appeared ordinary. Too ordinary. Then came the first ripple. It was small, almost invisible, a hesitation in the captain's breathing, a moment where his hand froze mid-motion as he reached for a switch. The first officer glanced sideways, his brow furrowed. "Captain, you okay?" Reynolds tried to answer, but his words slurred. He blinked, struggling to focus, his chest tightening. Before Hayes could react, the captain slumped sideways, his body pressing against the controls. Alarms blared briefly before the first officer yanked the yoke, stabilizing the aircraft. In the cabin, no one noticed yet. The engines hummed steadily, the ride smooth as ever. Drinks were still being served, laughter still echoed. But behind the locked cockpit door, the heart of the aircraft had faltered. And in row 14, the quiet passenger looked up from his book, his sharp ears catching the subtle change in engine pitch, the faint tremor that rippled through the cabin. He didn't move. Not yet. But in his stillness was a readiness, as if he had been waiting his whole life for a moment like this. Above the endless plains at 30,000 feet, an ordinary flight was about to become anything but ordinary. At 30,000 feet, the cabin of Flight 2281 was a floating world of normalcy. Drinks clinked on tray tables, the scent of fresh coffee drifted down the aisle, and the low murmur of conversation mixed with the steady hum of engines. It felt safe, routine, ordinary. But inside the cockpit, the illusion of calm was cracking. Captain Reynolds shifted uneasily in his seat. Sweat prickled at his brow, and a strange heaviness pressed against his chest. His vision blurred again, this time sharper, as if the edges of the instrument panel were dissolving. He tightened his grip on the yoke, blinking hard. His mouth went dry. "Captain, you good?" First Officer Hayes asked, glancing sideways. Reynolds nodded faintly, trying to steady his breathing. "Just fatigue. Didn't sleep much." He forced a chuckle, but it sounded hollow. Hayes frowned. Pilots didn't admit weakness easily, but something in Reynolds' tone worried him. Still, the flight was stable, the autopilot engaged, and Denver lay less than 2 hours ahead. He turned his focus back to the navigation display. Seconds later, everything changed. Reynolds let out a strangled gasp, his hand jerking toward his chest. His body convulsed once, then slumped violently sideways, his full weight collapsing onto the yoke. The controls jerked forward, and the plane dipped abruptly. Warning chimes shrieked through the cockpit, lights flashing across the panel. "Captain!" Hayes shouted, grabbing for the controls. He shoved Reynolds upright enough to free the yoke, fighting to stabilize the aircraft. The sudden pitch sent a ripple through the cabin, drinks spilling, passengers gasping as turbulence rocked them unexpectedly. In row 22, one of the college students cursed as soda splashed over his hoodie. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, glancing around nervously. Most passengers assumed it was turbulence. Only the crew knew better. Hayes toggled the intercom, his voice taut but steady. "Flight attendants to the cockpit now." Within seconds, the door opened, and Senior Flight Attendant Morales appeared, her eyes widening at the sight of the unconscious captain slumped in his seat. "Get him out," Hayes barked, still gripping the controls with white knuckles. "Now." Morales and another attendant rushed forward, struggling to pull Reynolds free of the seat. His head lolled, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. They managed to drag him into the galley just outside the cockpit, lowering him to the floor. Passengers craned their necks as the commotion spilled into the cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows as whispers spread like wildfire. "What's happening? Is someone hurt? Was that the pilot?" Morales knelt over Reynolds, fumbling with the intercom. "We need medical assistance. If anyone on board is a doctor or nurse, please come forward immediately." The announcement sent a shockwave through the cabin. A middle-aged woman in row 7 stood quickly. "I'm a nurse," she called, pushing past stunned passengers toward the galley. A man in row 19 hesitated, then added, "I'm a paramedic." Both hurried forward, hearts pounding. Meanwhile, Hayes wrestled with his own storm. His training had prepared him for emergencies: engine failures, instrument malfunctions, severe turbulence, but not this. A captain incapacitated mid-flight turned the cockpit into a battlefield of responsibility. He was suddenly alone at the controls, the weight of 150 lives pressing down on him. "Denver Center, this is Flight 2281, Hayes transmitted, his voice clipped. "We have a medical emergency. Captain is incapacitated. I am the sole operating pilot." The reply came back instantly, calm but urgent. "Copy, Flight 2281. You are priority for emergency landing clearance. Stand by." Back in the galley, the nurse checked Reynolds' pulse, shaking her head. "It's weak, too weak. We need oxygen." The paramedic grabbed the emergency medical kit, working with trembling hands as Morales fetched a portable oxygen tank. Passengers craned their necks, horror dawning as they pieced together the truth. Their captain, the man entrusted with their lives, was down. A ripple of panic spread through the rows. Some passengers whispered frantically, others clutched hands, their voices shaking. Who's flying the plane if the pilot's here? Can the co-pilot do it alone? Oh my God, what if something happens to him too? In row 14, the quiet passenger closed his book slowly, placing it carefully on the tray table. His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, scanning the scene. He had been listening since the moment the plane dipped. He knew turbulence when he felt it, and this hadn't been turbulence. This was something far worse. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, urging calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Everything is under control." But their voices carried an edge, betraying the truth. Nothing was under control. Hayes fought to steady his breathing in the cockpit. His training told him he could land the plane alone if he had to, but Denver's forecast had called for heavy crosswinds and rain, a tricky combination for even the most seasoned pilot. And he wasn't seasoned. He was competent, yes, but relatively young, with only a fraction of the captain's hours. His mind raced with calculations, procedures, and worst-case scenarios. The intercom buzzed again. It was Morales. "First officer, Captain Reynolds is unresponsive. We've got medical help, but it doesn't look good." Hayes swallowed hard. "Understood. Keep me updated. I'll do what I can." He ended the call, his throat tightening. Alone, entirely alone. In the cabin, The atmosphere shifted from confusion to dread. Parents hugged their children tighter. A woman whispered a prayer, clutching a cross around her neck. Even the college students, once boisterous, sat in stunned silence. Everyone understood, at least instinctively, that their safety hung by a thread. And then, movement. From row 14, the quiet man finally stood. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He simply rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked calmly toward the galley where the captain lay. His steady demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. Passengers watched him, whispering, "Who's that? Is he a doctor? Maybe he's crew?" But his steps carried a different weight, a different kind of purpose. He wasn't rushing to save a life. He was moving toward something larger, toward the cockpit. And though no one in the cabin knew it yet, his next words would change the fate of Flight 2281. The galley outside the cockpit had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos. Captain Reynolds lay sprawled on the narrow floor, oxygen mask strapped over his pale face, his chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. The nurse and paramedic hovered over him, exchanging terse medical jargon while flight attendants scrambled for supplies. Passengers craned their necks, desperate for answers. From row after row, heads tilted into the aisle, eyes wide, whispering. The narrow space of the aircraft magnified every sound, the hiss of oxygen, the muffled urgency in the nurse's voice, the unsteady rhythm of Reynolds' breathing. It spread through the cabin like wildfire. The captain was down. Fear is contagious, and in the pressurized capsule of Flight 2281, there was no escape from it. The murmurs rose into frantic whispers, then into outright questions tossed toward the crew. What happened to the pilot? Is he dead? Who's flying this plane? The flight attendants tried to contain it. Morales, her professional smile stretched thin, walked briskly down the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, everything is under control. Please remain calm and stay seated." But her voice wavered. Passengers could hear it, could see the tremor in her hand as she steadied herself against a seatback. The illusion of control was slipping, and once it slipped, it was nearly impossible to recover. In row 22, the college students sat in uncharacteristic silence. Their jokes had died. One stared at the window, his reflection pale against the bright sky outside. Another pulled out his phone, whispering into it as if leaving a voicemail. "Hey, Mom, it's me. Just in case. I love you." A middle-aged man in row 18 gripped his armrests, knuckles white, muttering, "This is it. This is it." His wife pressed her hand over his, her lips moving in silent prayer. Farther forward, the mother in row 8 clutched her sleeping toddler protectively, her wide eyes darting toward the galley. She rocked her child instinctively, whispering soothing nonsense words, though her own hands trembled. The air in the cabin felt heavier, thicker. The oxygen was the same, but panic changes the way people breathe. For some, it became shallow and fast. For others, slow and suffocating. It was as if the walls of the plane were closing in. The businessman in first class finally snapped. Slamming his laptop shut, he unbuckled and stood. "Someone needs to tell us what's going on," he shouted, voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "We have a right to know if the pilot's dead." Morales hurried to intercept him, pressing her palms gently against his shoulders. "Sir, please sit down. The first officer is in full control. We are handling this." But the man didn't back down. His voice grew louder, carrying through the cabin. "Handling this? The captain's on the floor, isn't he? Tell us the truth." His words ignited the simmering fear. Dozens of conversations erupted at once, questions, accusations, frantic speculation. What if the co-pilot can't land it? They'll crash us into the mountains. Are we going to die up here? The noise swelled until it felt like the plane itself vibrated with panic. And then, cutting through it all, came the voice of a child. A boy, no older than 9, sitting in row 11 beside his father. "Dad, are we going to crash?" His words were soft, but in the sudden lull that followed, they seemed to echo through the cabin. The father hugged him close, unable to answer. The quiet man in row 14 closed his book. He placed it gently into the seat pocket in front of him, folded the receipt still marking his page, and exhaled slowly. His eyes swept the cabin, the crying child, the praying woman, the shouting businessman. Fear was a storm building momentum, and he could see it consuming the passengers. He stayed still for a moment longer, waiting. Patience was second nature to him. In his world, timing was everything. Act too soon, and you revealed yourself before you were needed. Act too late, and the window closed forever. Up front, Hayes' voice crackled faintly over the intercom, an attempt to soothe. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer. We are experiencing a medical emergency with our captain, but I assure you, I am fully capable of flying and landing this aircraft. Please remain calm, keep your seatbelts fastened, and allow our crew to assist. Thank you." The words were steady, but not strong enough. The passengers heard the strain beneath them. They could sense the young man's fear. Hayes sounded like someone holding on by his fingertips. The quiet passenger knew then. The time for waiting was over. He rose smoothly from his seat, his movements unhurried, almost casual. The storm of panic seemed to still as people turned to watch him. He wasn't tall, nor imposing, but there was something in the way he carried himself calm, centered, deliberate, that drew every eye. He stepped into the aisle. The businessman paused mid-shout, his words faltering. The praying woman's lips stilled. Even the child in row 11 stopped crying, watching curiously. The man walked forward, past rows of fearful faces, until he reached the galley. Morales glanced up, startled. "Sir, please return to your seat. I can help," he said simply. His voice was low, calm, and carried a weight that silenced her instantly. A paramedic and nurse looked up from Reynolds, confused. "Are you a doctor?" the nurse asked. The man shook his head once. "No, not that kind of help." He glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Morales. "Let me in." For a moment, silence hung in the air, disbelief crackling between them. A passenger? Wanting access to the cockpit? Under any other circumstance, it would have been unthinkable. But something in his tone, in his eyes, in the steady way he stood there, amidst the chaos, something made Morales hesitate. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. Behind the door, Hayes' voice called again through the intercom. "Morales status?" The attendant swallowed, torn between protocol and instinct. She looked back at the quiet man. He gave the smallest nod, as though confirming something unspoken. Her hand moved toward the keypad. The passengers leaned forward, holding their breath. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he intended to do. But they could all feel it that something extraordinary was about to happen. The cockpit door clicked open, and the quiet man from row 14 stepped inside. The cockpit door shut behind him with a heavy click, sealing off the noise of the cabin. For a moment, the man from row 14 stood still, his hand resting lightly against the bulkhead, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside. The cockpit smelled faintly of coffee, electronics, and the metallic tongue of Stress Hayes' sweat, dampening the air. First Officer Hayes sat rigid in the right-hand seat, headset pressed tight against his ear, one hand gripping the yoke as if it were the last solid thing in the world. His other hand darted across the controls, silencing alarms, adjusting altitude. The tremor in his jaw betrayed his composure. Hayes turned, startled at the sight of the stranger. "Who are you? You can't be in here." The man met his eyes with a calm steadiness that cut through the panic. "You need help." His tone wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Hayes shook his head, defensive. "I've got this." "Protocol doesn't allow." His voice cracked on the word protocol, betraying the weight pressing down on him. He glanced at the empty captain's seat, then back at the instruments. His youth showed in that glance. A man trained, competent, but suddenly made small by the enormity of the situation. The quiet man stepped closer, careful not to invade too much space. His voice softened but carried authority. "You're flying alone in rough weather ahead. Your captain is down. You don't have to do this alone." Hayes hesitated. The storm of decisions in his head clashed with instinct. He wanted to say no, wanted to follow rules, keep control, remain the sole pilot in command. But deep down, he knew. The weight was too much. The man placed one hand gently on the empty captain's seat. "Let me sit." For a long moment, Hayes said nothing. The engines thrummed, the autopilot light blinked steadily, and the faint static of air traffic control filled the silence. Finally, Hayes exhaled. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he eased into the seat, moving with the quiet precision of someone who belonged there. His hands brushed the controls, not fumbling, not tentative, but familiar, as though reacquainting themselves with an old friend. In the cabin beyond, the tension was palpable. Passengers strained to see through the narrow crack of the door before it closed, whispering furiously. Some thought the man must be an air marshal. Others guessed he was a pilot from another airline, traveling off-duty. A few, clinging to hope, believed he was something more, a savior, sent at the last possible moment. Inside the cockpit, Hayes stared as the stranger adjusted the seat, checked the instruments with practiced eyes, and nodded slowly. "She's holding steady," the man murmured, almost to himself. "You still haven't answered me," Hayes pressed. His voice carried the desperate edge of a man dangling from a cliff, unsure whether to trust the outstretched hand reaching toward him. The man's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You don't need my name." "Not yet. What you need is to land this plane, and I can get you there." Hayes shook his head, still clinging to skepticism. "Even if you were a pilot, this isn't a fighter jet. This is a commercial 737. It's different. The man's hands moved swiftly, flipping a switch before Hayes could finish. "Hydraulic pressure on System A is low. Switch to B, otherwise your flaps won't respond on descent." His tone was casual, like pointing out a pothole in the road. Hayes blinked. He hadn't even checked that yet. The man had seen it instantly. "Who are you?" Hayes asked again, this time less confrontational and more pleading. The man looked out through the windshield, at the endless blue sky ahead. For a moment, he seemed far away, as if seeing something that wasn't there. Then he turned back, voice steady. "Someone who's been here before. Different aircraft, different skies, but the same weight in my hands." Hayes stared at him, realization dawning, though he didn't yet know the full truth. He could feel it. This wasn't a passenger guessing his way through. This was someone forged in a cockpit. Someone who carried years of flight in his bones. Meanwhile, in the galley, Captain Reynolds' condition worsened. The nurse and paramedic worked furiously, attaching a portable defibrillator, their voices sharp with urgency. "Pulse is dropping, get the pads on him." The flight attendants hovered, torn between helping the captain and calming a cabin of 150 anxious souls. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Morales repeated into the PA, her voice cracking. "Our crew and medical personnel are assisting the captain." The aircraft remains under control, but the murmurs refuse to die down. They're lying. We're going to crash. What if the co-pilot panics? The fear was a living thing now, moving from row to row, gripping tighter with every unanswered question. Back in the cockpit, Hayes' hands trembled slightly on the controls. The stranger's presence, though unsettling, was grounding him. He hadn't realized until that moment how badly he needed anyone beside him. Pilots were trained as a team for a reason. The stranger's voice was calm, measured. You're good, Hayes, I can see it. But you're green. You don't have the hours for this weather, not alone. And Denver's runway approaches? They'll chew you up if you come in too fast. Hayes whipped his head around. How do you know my name? The man finally allowed himself a faint smile. It's on your ID badge. For the first time, Hayes let out a short, shaky laugh. The tension broke, just slightly. Listen, the man continued, his tone sharpening. You can fight me, or you can use me. I'm not here to take over. I'm here to get you and everyone back there on the ground alive. That's all. Hayes hesitated one last time, then nodded slowly. All right. Show me what you can do. The stranger's fingers danced across the overhead panel with confidence, adjusting switches, confirming settings. His movements were smooth, too practiced to belong to an amateur. Hayes watched, awe beginning to replace doubt. For the first time since Reynolds collapsed, the cockpit didn't feel suffocating. It felt steady, controlled. In row 14, the stranger's abandoned paperback rested quietly in the seat pocket, its story left unfinished. Because the man who had been reading it was now writing a new one that would decide whether 150 people lived or died. And though no one in the cabin knew it yet, the call sign he once carried in another life would soon echo across the radios again. 3 simple syllables that would send shivers down the spines of air traffic controllers who remembered the name. Falcon 2. But for now, he remained silent, the mystery deepening. He wasn't ready to reveal everything not until he had to. The plane flew steady through the clear blue, but beneath the surface, the storm was building. The cockpit thrummed with an uneasy rhythm, a steady hum of the engines, the faint hiss of static from the radios, the staccato beeping of a warning that Hayes had silenced but not solved. Every sound carried weight. Every second felt stretched thin. Hayes' fingers clenched the yoke, his knuckles pale. The stranger sat beside him in the captain's seat now, shoulders squared, posture calm. He wasn't fumbling, wasn't overwhelmed. If anything, he looked as though he belonged there, as though slipping into the left-hand seat was less an intrusion and more a return. Denver's still over an hour out, Hayes muttered, eyes flicking to the navigation display. We've got crosswinds and weather ahead. I can handle it, but he stopped, swallowing. It's a hell of a lot harder without backup. You won't be alone, the stranger said quietly. His hands moved across the overhead panel, checking fuel, hydraulics, electrics with precise efficiency. He worked like someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Hayes watched him, torn between relief and suspicion. You talk like a pilot. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he toggled the COM panel, adjusting the frequency with practiced fingers. The gesture was fluid, natural, not something a passenger could fake. Hayes felt his chest tighten. Who are you? He demanded again, more firmly this time. I need to know before I let you touch another switch. The man's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I've flown aircraft in situations worse than this. Situations where one mistake meant more than a plane going down. It meant entire missions lost. Lives lost. I'm not guessing, son. I know what I'm doing. Hayes blinked at him, his breath catching. The weight in the man's voice wasn't bravado. It was memory. Hard-earned, battle-forged memory. The stranger leaned forward, pressing the mic button on the yoke. His voice slid into the radio, low, calm, and certain. Denver Center, this is Falcon 2. The cabin of silence that followed seemed almost physical. Hayes' head snapped toward him. What did you just say? The radio crackled alive. A pause, then a voice answered, tinged with surprise. Falcon 2. Say again? Did you just identify as Falcon 2? The stranger's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Affirmative. Falcon 2. Requesting coordination for emergency landing assistance. Captain incapacitated. Assisting first officer. Aircraft stable for now. The reply came back, faster, sharper. The controllers weren't just acknowledging. They were recognizing. Copy, Falcon 2. We're pulling up your record now. Stand by. Hayes' mind reeled. Recognition? ATC recognizing a call sign like that? It wasn't possible. Call signs weren't names you carried lightly. They belonged to legends in the aviation world, the kind of pilots whose reputation traveled far beyond their squadrons. You're military, Hayes said, almost whispering. Air Force? The stranger's eyes flicked briefly to him, then back to the horizon. Retired. Years ago. Falcon 2. Hayes repeated, testing the words. They tasted foreign, yet powerful. I've heard that before? He had. In training, in late-night conversations at pilot bars, whispered like myth. Falcon 2 wasn't just a call sign, it was a story. A fighter pilot who had pulled off maneuvers that defied physics. A man who had once brought a crippled jet home, with no hydraulics and half his instruments gone. Someone who'd been at the tip of the spear in missions no one could fully talk about. Hayes stared at him. You're that Falcon 2? The man shrugged, eyes still on the sky. I was once. Now I'm just a passenger who got lucky enough to be on this flight. Hayes let out a short, disbelieving laugh. It was half relief, half awe. Lucky? Feels more like fate. The stranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, in the cabin, panic was still festering. Morales and the crew worked to keep order, but whispers carried. Passengers speculated wildly, some convinced the plane was flying on autopilot with no one truly in control. Then the PA crackled, and Hayes' voice rang out, steadier now. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer. We have a qualified pilot assisting me in the cockpit. I repeat, another pilot is assisting. We are stable and on course to Denver. Please remain calm. The murmurs quieted instantly. The words another pilot rippled through the cabin like a lifeline. Some passengers sagged with relief. Others broke into nervous laughter. Even the crying child in row 11 quieted, his father stroking his hair with shaky hands. But Morales wasn't done. She leaned into the PA, her voice softer but reassuring. He's not just any pilot. He's a former Air Force aviator. The effect was electric. The businessman in first class froze mid-sentence, his anger deflating. The praying woman's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. And in row 22, the college students leaned forward, wide-eyed. No way, one whispered. We've got a Top Gun guy flying us? For the first time since Reynolds collapsed, hope surged through the cabin. Back in the cockpit, Hayes felt it too. The stranger's presence wasn't just practical, it was psychological. The weight on his shoulders had shifted. He wasn't alone anymore. Falcon 2, Hayes said, trying the words again, as if testing their strength. Why didn't you say something sooner? The man's eyes stayed on the instruments, scanning. Because I wasn't needed. Until now. The simplicity of the answer struck Hayes. This was a man who didn't seek the spotlight, didn't rush to claim control. He waited until the moment demanded him. And now that it had, he was all in. "Denver Center Falcon 2, the stranger said into the mic again, requesting updated weather on approach and runway availability. The controller's voice came back instantly, sharper, almost reverent. "Falcon 2, you've got priority. Runway 34 right cleared. Winds are 26 knots cross. We'll vector traffic out of your way. You just say what you need." Hayes stared at the panel, his chest tightening with awe. The respect in a TC's voice was unmistakable. They weren't just dealing with a passenger. They were dealing with a legend. Falcon 2, the name that had been whispered in training rooms, written into unofficial history books of aviators, passed down like folklore. And now he was here, in the captain's seat, on Flight 2281. Hayes felt the plane steady beneath him, the storm outside still distant, but approaching. And for the first time since Reynolds collapsed, he believed, not just hoped, but believed, they might actually make it. The moment Falcon 2's call sign echoed over the radio, a subtle shift rippled through the cockpit. It wasn't just recognition from air traffic control. It was as if the weight in the room had rearranged itself. The fear that had pressed against Hayes' chest like a vice loosened ever so slightly. He wasn't alone anymore. Falcon 2 leaned back in the captain's seat, one hand resting lightly on the yoke, the other adjusting knobs and switches, as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. His touch wasn't rushed or showy. It was deliberate, confident. Every movement communicated a truth Hayes couldn't ignore. This man had done this before, in ways Hayes couldn't yet understand. "Denver Center's clearing traffic for us," Falcon 2 said, his voice steady. "We'll have priority all the way in. But first, we need to get you ready for that landing." "Me?" Hayes blinked. "You," Falcon 2 confirmed. "I can help, but you're the first officer, and this is still your flight. My job is to make sure you don't break under the pressure. You're the hands on this one." Hayes' stomach nodded. He wanted to argue, to insist that Falcon 2 should take full control. But as he looked into the man's eyes, he realized what this was about. Falcon 2 wasn't just flying the plane. He was teaching Hayes, forcing him to rise in the moment instead of shrinking from it. "You've flown this bird before," Falcon 2 continued, nodding toward the panel. "So trust what you know. Let me fill in the gaps." Hayes swallowed, his hand tightening around the yoke. "All right. What do we do first?" "Systems check," Falcon 2 replied. His voice dropped into a cadence Hayes recognized military crispness, call and response. "Fuel? Balanced? Sufficient for Denver. Hydraulics? System A low, switch to B stable. Electrics? Good. Backups online. Good," Falcon 2 said. "Now weather." He pointed to the screen displaying storm data. "You've got crosswinds on approach, turbulence in descent, and possible shear. Not pretty, but manageable." Hayes exhaled slowly. "Manageable," he repeated, trying the word on his tongue like it was foreign. Falcon 2 nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. The storm doesn't beat you. It tests you. If you let it, it makes you better." For a moment, Hayes almost smiled. The cockpit settled into rhythm. Falcon 2 guided. Hayes executed. The older man's calm energy radiated through the cramped space, washing away the raw edge of panic. He wasn't barking orders. He was steadying the younger pilot with quiet authority, the kind that comes from experience written into muscle memory. Outside, the skies began to change. The clear blue haze gave way to darker streaks of gray. The plane shuddered as turbulence nudged its wings, a reminder of what waited ahead. Hayes gritted his teeth, holding the yoke steady. Falcon 2 leaned slightly forward, his voice even. "Ride it. Don't fight it too hard." Feel the rhythm of the airwork with it, not against it. The words, simple as they were, clicked. Hayes eased his grip, letting the aircraft settle instead of forcing it. The shutter smoothed into a roll, still rough, but less violent. "That's it," Falcon 2 said. "You see? Control isn't about force. It's about finesse." Hayes nodded, sweat dampening his collar, but a flicker of pride sparking in his chest. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Morales walked the aisles, her voice low and reassuring. "We are under control," she repeated to nervous passengers. "One of our passengers is assisting in the cockpit. He's a highly trained pilot." Some passengers clung to her words, nodding, whispering prayers of thanks. Others remained tense, white-knuckling armrests. But the energy had shifted, from chaos toward cautious hope. In the galley, the nurse tending to Captain Reynolds shook her head. "Pulse is weak, but stable. He's not waking up anytime soon." The words carried a grim weight. Everyone knew what that meant. Reynolds was out of the fight for good. It was up to Hayes and the stranger now. Back in the cockpit, Hayes flipped switches under Falcon 2's guidance, his confidence building with each completed task. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He glanced sideways. "Why me? If you're Falcon 2, why not just take over completely?" Falcon 2 didn't look up from the instruments. "Because this is your bird, and your career. If I steal it from you, you walk off that plane a co-pilot who couldn't cut it. If you land it with me backing you, you walk off a captain in spirit, even if the stripes aren't on your sleeve yet." Hayes froze, the words hitting harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone to believe in him. Falcon 2 adjusted a knob, then leaned back, his eyes narrowing on the horizon where storm clouds thickened. "Besides," he added softly, "my time at the stick ended years ago. But teaching? Passing it on? That's still my duty." The sincerity in his tone left no room for argument. The storm hit harder as the aircraft entered cloud layers. Rain streaked across the windshield. Thunder rumbled faintly, and the plane jolted in sharp bursts. Hayes gripped the controls, his knuckles white. "Eyes on your instruments," Falcon 2 reminded him. "Not the storm. Trust the gauges. They don't lie." Hayes focused, heart hammering, his world narrowing to the glowing dials before him. The artificial horizon, the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, they were his lifeline now. Falcon 2's voice cut through the roar of turbulence like steel. "Hold her steady. Small corrections. Don't chase every bump. Let the bird ride the air." Hayes did as told, his breathing shallow but controlled. The plane jolted again, dropping a few feet. Gasps echoed from the cabin behind them. But Hayes corrected smoothly this time, keeping the wings level. "Good," Falcon 2 said. "That's control. That's you, not the storm." For the first time since Reynolds collapsed, Hayes felt a surge of something fierce in his chest. Confidence. Denver Center? "Falcon 2, the older man called over the radio. We're through initial turbulence. Request updated vectors." "Copy, Falcon 2, came the swift reply. "Turn heading 270. Begin descent to flight level 200. Winds are gusting, but you're clear on priority." Hayes initiated the turn, following Falcon 2's guidance. The plane responded, stable despite the storm's grip. In the silence that followed, Hayes risked another glance at him. "You make it sound easy." Falcon 2 gave a small chuckle. "It's never easy. You just stop letting fear make it harder." Those words sank deep, becoming something Hayes knew he'd carry long after this flight. As the plane cut through the storm, Falcon 2 leaned back, his face illuminated by the dim glow of the panels. Outside, lightning forked across the sky, but his expression remained calm, resolute. Hayes realized then that this wasn't just about saving the passengers or landing the plane. This was about passing on a legacy from a legend to a rookie under the most impossible of circumstances. And though Falcon 2 hadn't flown in years, he had slipped seamlessly into command again, not by force, but by presence. By steadying a young pilot's trembling hands, by showing him how to find calm inside chaos. Taking command under pressure wasn't about seizing control. It was about giving it back. And as the storm grew thicker, both men knew the hardest part was yet to come. The descent began with a whisper, not a roar. A subtle tilt of the nose downward, the engines easing back, the altitude tape on the instrument panel slowly ticking down. To the passengers, it felt like little more than the natural rhythm of a flight nearing its end. But in the cockpit, Hayes knew the truth. This was where flights were won or lost. Denver Center Falcon 2. The calm voice cut into the radio again. Descending to 200. Request continuous updates on wind shear reports. The reply crackled through with urgency. Copy Falcon 2. Winds variable at 270. GUSTS 28 to 34. Moderate to severe turbulence on approach. Advisories issued for shear near final. Hayes swallowed hard. Severe turbulence. Wind shear. Words that made every pilot's pulse quicken. Beside him, Falcon 2 adjusted his headset, unshaken. All right, Hayes. You're in the chair. I'm your safety net, but this bird is yours. Hayes' hands trembled briefly as he nudged the yoke. His brain screamed at him to ask Falcon 2 to take over completely. But something deeper, maybe pride, maybe the belief Falcon 2 had planted, forced him to nod instead. I've got it. That's what I want to hear, Falcon 2 said. His tone wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the voice of a coach in the corner of a ring. The storm swallowed them in minutes. One moment, the horizon was faint gray. The next, they plunged into thick cloud banks that blanketed the windshield in sheets of white. Rain battered the fuselage like pebbles on glass. Thunder growled in the distance, and flashes of lightning cracked across the sky. The plane shuddered violently. Passengers gasped. Drinks toppled. The overhead bins rattled with a metallic groan. Morales clutched the intercom in the galley, her knuckles white. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, forcing her voice steady, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. This turbulence is expected on descent. But she couldn't mask the fear in her eyes. In the cockpit, the turbulence hit harder. The yoke jolted in Hayes' hands, slamming left, then right. His arms strained against it. His breath came in shallow bursts. Easy, Falcon 2 said, watching him. Don't fight the storm. Small corrections. Let her ride. Hayes gritted his teeth, loosening his grip slightly. The plane dipped again, the altimeter spinning downward faster than it should. Adrenaline surged through his veins. We're dropping too fast. Falcon 2's hand shot out, pointing to the vertical speed indicator. Check your descent rate. Look at the numbers, not your gut. You're fine. Breathe. Hayes forced his eyes back to the instruments. The rate was steep, but still safe. His chest eased. Falcon 2's voice had snapped him out of the panic spiral just in time. Lightning lit up the cockpit in a blinding flash. Hayes flinched. Falcon 2 didn't. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm as ever. You're flying the jet, Hayes. Don't let the jet fly you. The words became a mantra in Hayes' head. Over and over, as the plane jolted and bucked, he repeated them. Behind them, the passengers clung to armrests, whispering prayers, some crying softly. A child screamed as the aircraft jolted sharply, and his mother pulled him close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. The businessman in first class, who had barked commands earlier, now sat pale and silent, lips pressed into a thin line. The cabin was a crucible of fear, but the cockpit somehow remained a center of control, anchored by Falcon 2's presence. Denver Center, Falcon 2, the older pilot radioed again. Confirm runway lights are up. We'll need maximum visual. Affirmative, Falcon 2, the controller answered quickly. Runway 34, right fully lit. Winds now gusting 36 knots cross. You're cleared priority approach. Hayes' jaw tightened. 36? That's near limits. Falcon 2 gave a small nod. Close to limits, but not past them. We can make it. We? Hayes asked. Falcon 2's lips curved in the faintest smile. Yes, we? The descent steepened as they punched through heavier turbulence. The plane lurched downward in sudden drops that ripped gasps from the passengers. Hayes fought to keep his focus, his arms aching. Sweat ran down his temple, soaking into his collar. Falcon 2's voice was steady, metronomic. Adjust trim. Ease her nose. Watch your glide path. You're holding it, Hayes. You're holding it. The words landed like lifelines, each one pulling Hayes back from the brink of panic. Through the windshield, the thick clouds began to break in patches. The faint glow of city lights shimmered below. Denver. A glimmer of salvation beneath the storm. Hayes exhaled sharply, his chest loosening. But Falcon 2 wasn't celebrating yet. Don't relax. The approach is the hardest part. Stay sharp. The radio buzzed again. Falcon 2, Denver Tower. Wind shear alert. Final approach. Runway 34 right. Moderate to severe. Advise. Hayes' stomach dropped. Wind shear on final. The nightmare scenario. He turned to Falcon 2, wide-eyed. What do we do if? Falcon 2 cut him off with a firm nod. If we hit shear, you power up, nose level, and go around. No hesitation. Trust me, son, hesitation kills. Commit to the maneuver, and you'll live to try again. Hayes swallowed hard, nodding. His pulse thudded in his ears. The plane jolted again, harder than before. An oxygen mask in row 27 tumbled loose, dangling like a grim omen. Passengers screamed. Morales and the crew strapped into their jump seats, whispering prayers under their breath. Stabilize, Falcon 2 commanded, his eyes never leaving the instruments. Hayes fought the yoke, his whole body tense, but somehow he steadied the descent again. The jet responded, leveling just enough. Good, Falcon 2 said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of certainty. That's how you fight storms. One correction at a time. The ground grew closer. The clouds thinned. The city spread below them in streaks of gold and white. And ahead through the rain and crosswinds, the glowing lights of Denver's runway pierced the darkness like a beacon. Falcon 2's voice cut through the chaos one last time. You've got this, Hayes. Eyes forward. Fly the bird. Trust yourself. Hayes gripped the yoke tighter, his arms burning with strain. But for the first time that night, his heart didn't quake with fear. Because Falcon 2 believed. And in that moment, so did he. The runway lights gleamed brighter, the storm howled louder, and the passengers braced for whatever came next. The white-knuckle descent was nearly over. The landing one way or another was seconds away. The glowing ribbon of runway lights stretched ahead like a lifeline, but Hayes knew they were far from safe. The wind screamed around the aircraft, rain hammered the fuselage, and the air itself felt a live and invisible force, determined to rip the plane from his control. Glide slope captured, Hayes muttered, his voice tight. On approach. Good, Falcon 2 said evenly, his eyes sharp on the instruments. Now focus. No distractions. This is where pilots earn their wings. The Boeing jolted sideways in a sudden gust. Hayes' heart jumped as he corrected with a hard push of the yoke. The wings leveled, but the plane still drifted. Falcon 2's voice cut in, calm but firm. Crosswind technique. Angle into it. Keep your nose pointed slightly into the wind. Don't let her drift off centerline. Hayes adjusted, sweat dripping into his collar. The runway lights wavered in the windshield, swaying left, then right. Every muscle in his arms burned. He wanted to scream, to let Falcon 2 take the controls, but the older man's steady presence anchored him. "You've got it, Hayes," Falcon 2 said. "Don't give up the jet. Not now." Behind them, the cabin was silent, except for muffled sobs. Morale sat rigid in her jump seat, eyes locked forward, whispering prayers she'd never admitted to believing in. A businessman clutched his briefcase like it was a life preserver. The little boy in row 11 buried his face against his mother's chest. Everyone knew they were seconds from the end. Whether safety or disaster, no one could tell. The altimeter wound down. 500 feet. 400. Suddenly the plane lurched downward, far sharper than before. The warning system blared in a mechanical monotone. Sink rate, sink rate. Wind shear. Hayes' breath caught. His instincts screamed at him to freeze. But Falcon 2's voice slammed through the panic like a hammer. Power up. Nose level. Go around now. Hayes shoved the throttles forward, engines roaring in response. The plane surged, shuddering violently as the wind fought back. Falcon 2's hand hovered just above the controls, not touching, not stealing command, but ready if Hayes faltered. Hold it, don't overpitch. Falcon 2 barked. Hayes fought the urge to yank back too hard. He leveled the nose, pushing through the wind shear with raw determination. The ground rushed closer, the runway lights vanishing for a terrifying instant behind sheets of rain. Then suddenly, they were climbing again. The warning silenced. The plane stabilized. The passengers screamed with relief, a chorus of sobs, cheers, and nervous laughter. Hayes gasped, adrenaline flooding his veins. Falcon 2 gave a single nod. Good save. That was yours, Hayes, not mine. Hayes could barely speak, his throat tight. I thought we were done. You thought wrong, Falcon 2 said simply. You trusted your training. You listened. And you lived. They circled in the storm, the engines straining, while a TC vectored them back for another approach. Hayes' arms shook with fatigue, but determination burned brighter now. He had faced the storm once and survived. He would face it again. Falcon 2, Denver Tower, the radio crackled. Runway 34 right, still clear. Wind gusts holding steady at 32 knots. You're cleared for second approach. Copy, Falcon 2 replied. He glanced at Hayes. Ready? Hayes nodded, jaw clenched. Let's finish this. The second approach was smoother, not because the storm was weaker, but because Hayes was stronger. He held the yoke with controlled precision, angling into the crosswind, making smaller corrections, breathing evenly. Falcon 2 monitored, guiding with occasional words, but never taking over. 300 feet, Falcon 2 called out. Looking good. The runway lights blazed ahead, steady this time. Hayes' focus narrowed to a razor's edge. The turbulence still battered them, but he no longer reacted in panic. He responded with control. 200 feet. Hold your crosswind correction. Don't flare too early. The ground surged closer, rain streaking across the windshield. Hayes' knuckles whitened, but his grip was steady. 100 feet, Falcon 2 said quietly. His voice was calm, confident. Now fly her down, Hayes. Land this bird. Hayes eased back, engines humming, the jet descending with deliberate grace. The runway lights expanded in the glass until they filled his world. 50 feet. Steady. 20. Now flare. The yoke pulled gently, the nose lifting just enough. The wheels slammed down harder than perfect, but firm, controlled. A jolt rocked the cabin. Tires screeched. The reverse thrusters roared. The plane shuddered, slowing, the storm screaming around it, but unable to drag it back into the air. They were down. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the cabin erupted. Applause thundered through the rows. Passengers shouting, crying, embracing. Morales covered her face with her hands, sobbing with relief. Even the stern businessman wiped his eyes. In the cockpit, Hayes sagged against his seat, chest heaving. He laughed, breathless, almost disbelieving. We made it. Falcon 2 exhaled slowly, nodding. You made it. Hayes turned to him, eyes wide. I couldn't have done it without you. Falcon 2's gaze was steady. Yes, you could. You just didn't know it yet. Paramedics swarmed the plane as it taxied to the gate, rushing to Captain Reynolds, who still lay unconscious. Passengers filed out, some pausing to thank the flight attendants with trembling voices. A few tried to peek into the cockpit, but Falcon 2 remained seated, quiet, letting Hayes soak in the spotlight. When the last passengers disembarked, Hayes turned to him. They'll want to know who you are. You could be a hero again. You already are. Falcon 2 shook his head, unbuckling his harness. Heroes are the ones who finish the flight, not the ones who used to wear a call sign. He stood, stretching his stiff legs. My time passed a long time ago. Tonight wasn't about me. It was about you. Hayes stared, speechless. Falcon 2 placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Remember this, Hayes. The storm isn't your enemy, it's your test. And you passed. With that, he turned and stepped out of the cockpit. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a quiet exit down the jet bridge like any other passenger. By the time the media swarmed the terminal, hungry for the story of the collapsed captain and the miraculous landing, Falcon 2 was gone, vanishing into the anonymity he had carried onto the plane. But for Hayes, and for the 150 souls who survived Flight 2281, his presence was indelible. They didn't just remember a man. They remembered a call sign, whispered like a legend. Falcon 2. And though the man disappeared back into the crowd, his legacy lived on not in medals or headlines, but in the heart of a young pilot who now believed in himself, and in the passengers whose lives had been spared by the quiet hero at 30,000 feet.